Section 1. The Weight of the Punchline. The highway sign for Des Moines was the last thing I saw before I fell asleep in the back seat of my brother's SUV. I remember the hum of the tires and the sound of my sister Chloe giggling at something on her phone. My father was driving while my mother scrolled through hotel options for our supposed family bonding trip to Colorado. I felt safe. I felt like I belonged. That was my first mistake. When I woke up, the hum and the air conditioning were gone. The silence pressed against my eardrums. I opened my eyes to a flickering fluorescent light. I wasn't in the SUV anymore. I was sitting on a cold metal bench outside a closed gas station in a town I didn't recognize. The air smelled like damp asphalt and old diesel. I checked my pockets. My phone was gone, my wallet was gone, my jacket was gone. I was wearing a thin t-shirt and jeans in the middle of a Nebraska midnight. I stood up on stiff legs and scanned the empty lot. No black Tahoe, no tire marks, no note, just a vast horizon and the sound of a distant wind chime rattling against a rusted pole. I walked to the glass doors of the station, locked. Inside, an analog clock read 2014 a.m. I sat back down, trying to rationalize it. Maybe they went to a hotel and forgot I was in the back. No, I was in the third row seat. They would have had to move me, lift me out, place me here. This wasn't an accident. It was a logistics operation. I remembered dinner 6 hours earlier. My brother Mark joked about my new job in data analysis, calling me the human calculator. He laughed about how I was too stable, too predictable, too boring. My father said I needed a real-world challenge. I smiled and sipped my water, unaware the dinner had been a briefing for a prank. The hours crawled by. Every pair of headlights in the distance made my heart jump. I expected the Tahoe to return, Chloe filming, everyone laughing at my fear. I rehearsed my response. Calm, good one, no hard feelings. 1 hour passed. 2, 3. The Tahoe never came. The sun rose over the cornfields in bruised purple and orange. A rusted Ford F-150 pulled into the lot. An old man stepped out, looked at me, and unlocked the station without questions. I asked for a phone. He pointed to a landline. I called my father. Voicemail, my mother, voicemail, Mark, Chloe, all of them. They hadn't just left me, they had blocked me. I stood there listening to the dial tone. This wasn't just abandonment. It was an evaluation, a status game. Call the police and I was a loser. Beg for help and I was weak. They wanted panic. They wanted a story. I thanked the man, didn't ask for money or a ride, and went to the bathroom to splash cold water on my face. In the cracked mirror, I saw fear and betrayal. Beneath it, something colder settled in. They thought quiet meant harmless. They thought I was a calculator. Fine, I would be a calculator. Back at the counter, I saw newspapers, the date, and a flyer for a freight loading company. Day labor, $15 an hour, cash. I had no phone to call an Uber, no card to buy a bus ticket. I had my hands and my brain. I realized the only way to win was to stop playing their version of the game. They expected a victim, a tearful reunion, gratitude. I stayed silent because silence is the one thing people like them can't manipulate. I walked out of the gas station toward the industrial district without looking back at the highway or searching for the Tahoe. That was the moment I understood they hadn't just left me in Nebraska. They had left me behind in their lives. And when I saw them again, I would be someone they no longer recognized. But first, I needed to earn $40. Section 2. The Ghost in the Machine. The warehouse was a cavernous, metal beast that smelled of scorched shrink wrap and stale coffee. I spent 12 hours tossing crates of regional produce into the back of semi-trucks. My hands blistered within the first 3 hours. By the 6th, the blisters popped and bled. By the ninth, my shoulders felt like they were being ground into powder. The floor supervisor, a man named Miller who looked like he hadn't slept since the 90s, watched me. He didn't speak, just pointed to the next pallet. I didn't complain or ask for a break. Every time my muscles screamed, I thought about Chloe editing footage of me sleeping on that bench. I thought about my father bragging at the country club about teaching his son self-reliance. At 7:30 p.m., Miller handed me two $20 bills and a 10. "You're fast," he said, spitting into a trash can. "Back tomorrow?" "No," I said. "I'm moving on." I walked to a local library 20 minutes before closing and sat at a computer, my fingers trembling as I typed. I didn't log into social media or my personal email. I knew they would be watching for pings. They wanted to see me beg publicly so they could laugh at the engagement. Instead, I logged into a secondary encrypted work drive tied to freelance consulting. I had a few $1,000s in a business account they didn't know existed. I'd spent years being the boring one, quietly building a safety net my family assumed I was too unimaginative to create. I checked the map. I was in O'Neill, roughly 600 miles from Chicago. I could have bought a plane ticket or called a car, but that was too fast. If I appeared tomorrow, the prank would end too cleanly. I needed to disappear. Not because I was lost, but because I wanted them to feel the weight of what they'd done. I wanted laughter to turn into silence, silence into doubt, and doubt into fear. I booked a long-term stay at a small non-chain motel 3 towns over under a different name, then bought a flannel shirt, rugged boots, and a backpack from a thrift store. I looked invisible. As I walked toward the bus station, I saw a black SUV pull into a diner across the street. My heart stopped. It wasn't them, but for a moment I felt the urge to surrender. I stayed silent because I realized my family didn't love me. They loved the version of me they could control, the calculator who did their taxes and absorbed their mockery. Going back now would confirm everything they believed. I checked into the motel. The room smelled of lemon bleach and old cigarettes. I sat on the bed staring at the wall. My real phone probably had dozens of "Where are you?" texts. They would have returned to the gas station expecting me to wait like a loyal dog. When they found the bench empty, they would check the footage and see me walking away. They didn't have the power anymore. They were the ones searching. I was the one who knew exactly where I was. I spent 3 days working remotely on a data project for a client in London, making $6,000 in 72 hours. My body was in Nebraska. My mind was moving through the global financial grid. On the 4th day, I searched local news for missing persons. Nothing. They hadn't called the police. That would mean admitting to a crime. Then I saw a post in a community Facebook group. A grainy photo of me from the gas station camera. The caption didn't ask for help. It said, "If anyone sees this young man, please tell him the joke is over. We're tired of waiting." They weren't worried. They were annoyed. The pressure in my chest sharpened into something surgical. I opened my laptop and accessed my father's business accounts. I'd set up his cloud security years ago. I knew the passwords, the shelters, the secrets. I understood then that I wasn't going home. I was going to wait until uncertainty broke them, until they would give anything to hear my voice. I picked up the motel phone and dialed a number I'd memorized long ago, my father's biggest competitor. I stayed silent when the assistant answered. "I have some data you might find interesting," I said. Section 3. The Slow Burn of Absence. The silence of a motel room at 3 in the morning has a specific frequency. It's a low hum, a vibration that makes you realize how much noise you've been tolerating your entire life. For years, my life was filled with my family's noise, Mark's booming laughter at my expense, my mother's passive-aggressive critiques of my wardrobe, My father's lectures on assertiveness that were really insults. Now, in the Nebraska dark, there was only the sound of my own breathing. I stayed silent because I realized that for the first time in 26 years, no one was telling me who I was. I sat at the small laminate desk, the glow of my laptop the only light in the room. I had already made the call to my father's competitor, a man named Sterling who ran a logistics firm 3 times the size of my father's. I hadn't given him the data yet. I wasn't a thief or a traitor. Not yet. I was an architect, drawing blueprints for a house they would eventually have to live in. I realized my father's entire identity was built on the legacy. He wanted the family name to mean something, but he had outsourced its structural integrity to the person he respected the least, me. I managed the servers. I optimized the supply chain algorithms. I was the invisible hand that kept his dominance profitable. I checked the Find My app using a secondary account linked to Chloe's iPad, a leftover from helping her bypass a school firewall years ago. I saw a cluster of dots at a luxury resort in Aspen. They hadn't gone home. They had left me at a gas station, waited a few hours, grown annoyed, and continued their vacation. They were likely drinking expensive bourbon and complaining that I was ruining the mood. I checked Chloe's social media. She'd posted a snowy mountain peak with the caption, "Some people just can't take a joke, missing the calculator but loving the view." The comments were worse. Family friends laughed, joked that I'd turn up hungry or was probably hiding in a library. That was the moment I understood they didn't see me as human. I was a prop, a sitcom character who missed his cue. They weren't afraid I was hurt. They were offended. I wasn't participating in my own humiliation. I closed the laptop. My hands were steady now. A cold tranquility settled in. Over the next 4 hours, I disconnected myself. I moved my savings offshore. I changed recovery emails on every account I managed for them. I didn't lock them out. I just removed the emergency exits. I stayed silent because I wanted them to feel the air thinning when the numbers started to fail. The next morning, I bought work gloves and a high-visibility vest from a hardware store. I didn't need money. I needed cover. A man in a high-vis vest is invisible. I stood across from a local bank thinking about status. My father thought it was a Tahoe. My brother thought it was dominance. I realized real status is walking away without losing yourself. When I returned to the motel, a black SUV sat in the parking lot. My heart didn't react. I walked past it, locked my door, and didn't check the window. I didn't care if it was them. I was no longer the boy on the bench. I was the ghost in their machine, and I was about to start deleting code. Section 4. The Sound of Breaking Glass. By day 7, the tone of the social media posts shifted. The family first hashtags disappeared. Chloe's latest post wasn't a mountain, it was a blurry photo of the gas station in O'Neill. The caption was shorter. "Seriously, stop it now. This isn't funny anymore. Call Mom." I realized the power had shifted. The uncertainty was starting to rot their confidence. They had returned to the scene of the crime, and they had returned to the scene of the crime, and they had probably checked the local hospitals. They had probably realized that their boring son didn't have a digital footprint anymore. I stayed silent because every hour I didn't call was a strike against my father's ego. He would be forced to explain my disappearance to the resort staff, to his friends, eventually to the police. And he would have to tell them the truth. I left him at a gas station for a laugh, and now I don't know where he is. I decided it was time to give them a sign, not a plea for help, but a demonstration of competence. I accessed my father's corporate server. I didn't delete anything. I simply adjusted the shipping logistics for his 3 largest clients. I rerouted the deliveries to a holding warehouse in Omaha, a facility I had rented using the cash I earned from Miller and the freelance project. It was a perfectly legal move within the company's bylaws, as I was still technically the director of systems operations. But on paper, it looked like a catastrophic glitch. To the clients, it looked like my father had lost control of his own supply chain. Within an hour, my father's phone, which I was tracking through the server logs, began to blow up. He wasn't calling me. He was calling his office, screaming at his assistants, demanding to know why 40% of his inventory was sitting in a parking lot in Omaha. I sat in my motel room, eating a sandwich from the deli, and watched the digital chaos unfold. I felt a quiet, surgical satisfaction. This wasn't revenge. Revenge is loud. Revenge is a shouting match in a driveway. This was a correction. I was simply showing him the value of the calculator he found so disposable. That afternoon, a private investigator, hired by my father, no doubt, arrived at the motel. I saw him through the gap in the curtains. He was talking to the manager, showing him a photo of me. The manager, a woman I had tipped $20 every morning to keep the "No Disturb" sign on my door, shook her head. She didn't lie, she just didn't recognize the man in the photo. In the photo, I was wearing a suit and glasses. Today, I was wearing a flannel shirt and a week's worth of stubble. I realized I had become a stranger to my own life, and I liked the stranger better. I stayed silent as the investigator walked back to his car. I stayed silent as he drove away. I stayed silent because the pressure was finally high enough to cause a fracture. That night, I received a notification. My father had finally tried to access the emergency server, the one I had built for him. He entered his password. Access denied. He tried again. Access denied. I had changed the security question. The question used to be, "What is your son's middle name?" I changed it to, "Where did you leave me?" I watched the server logs as he tried to type O'Neill. Incorrect. He tried Nebraska. Incorrect. He tried gas station. Incorrect. He didn't know the answer because, to him, the location didn't matter. Only the punchline did. That was the moment I understood. He didn't even remember the name of the town. He hadn't bothered to look at the map when he dragged me out of the car. He had just seen an empty spot on the earth and decided it was good enough for me. I picked up the burner phone I had bought. I dialed my mother's number. She answered on the first ring. Her voice was frantic, thin, and aged by 10 years. "Hello? Who is this? Is this you?" I didn't say a word. I just let her hear the sound of the Nebraska wind through the open motel window. I let her hear the silence she had helped create. "Please," she sobbed, "tell us where you are. Your father is. He's losing everything. The business is falling apart. Just come back. We'll tell everyone it was a misunderstanding. Please." I stayed silent because misunderstanding was still a lie. They still wanted to control the narrative. They wanted me to come back and help them cover up their own cruelty. I hung up the phone. I looked at the contract from Sterling, my father's competitor. It was sitting in my inbox, offering me a position as Chief Technology Officer with a signing bonus that would pay for 5 years of my life. I realized I wasn't going back to Chicago, not as the person they knew. I packed my small backpack. I left the high-vis vest on the bed. I walked out of the motel and looked at the horizon. The sun was setting again, but the purple and orange didn't look like a bruise anymore. It looked like an invitation. The story wasn't over. The power shift was only beginning. My father still had his company, and my brother still had his ego. But they didn't have their architect anymore, and without an architect, even the tallest towers eventually start to lean. I walked toward the bus station. My target wasn't home. My target was Omaha, I had a warehouse full of inventory to manage, and a father who was about to find out exactly how much a calculator is worth when it stops working for you. Section 5. The Architect of Shadows. Omaha in the winter feels like a city made of iron and ice. I arrived with nothing but a backpack and the digital keys to my father's kingdom. I didn't check into a hotel this time. I used a portion of my freelance earnings to rent a short-term corporate loft overlooking the rail yards. From the window, I could see the skeletal remains of the industry that built my father's pride. I realized the physical world is remarkably easy to manipulate when you control the data that governs it. My father, Richard, always boasted that he was a boots-on-the-ground businessman. He believed in handshakes, shouting matches, and the sheer force of his presence. He never understood that in the modern world the boots are directed by the numbers. If the numbers say the boots should be in a frozen lot in Nebraska, that's where they stay. I stayed silent because I wanted the vacuum of my absence to pull the truth out of them. Every day I spent in that loft, watching the logistics logs, I saw the panic escalate. The holding warehouse I had rerouted his inventory to was now under a legal administrative hold due to a clerical error I had subtly embedded in the manifest. Richard's calls to the warehouse were recorded by the automated system I had installed years ago. I listened to them at night. "Do you know who I am?" he screamed at a confused clerk in one recording. "That's $3 million of perishable and seasonal goods sitting on your dock. Release it now." The clerk's response was always the same. "Sir, the system shows an unresolved lien from a secondary contractor. We can't move anything until the Director of Operations signs off. We've been trying to reach a Mr. Silas Thorne. Is he with you?" Silas Thorne, my name. The name they had laughed at while I slept on a gas station bench. I realized my father was finally realizing that Silas Thorne wasn't just his son. He was the only person who knew how to unlock the door to his own fortune. The psychological pressure was now shifting from, "Where is he?" to, "What did he do?" My brother Mark started posting on LinkedIn, not to find me, but to save face. He posted articles about resilience in supply chain management and navigating unforeseen disruptions. He was trying to signal to the industry that everything was fine, but his eyes in the profile picture looked hollow. He knew the clients were starting to cancel. I decided to move to Phase 2. I didn't want to destroy the company. I wanted to prune it. I wanted to remove the rot. And in this family, the rot was the belief that people are disposable. I reached out to Sterling again. We met in a quiet, high-end steakhouse in downtown Omaha. He was an older man, sharp, with eyes that saw through the theatrics of the business world. He looked at my flannel shirt and my calm expression and smiled. "Your father thinks you were kidnapped," Sterling said, cutting into his steak, "or that you had a nervous breakdown. He's been calling everyone in the tri-state area." "And what do you think?" I asked. "I think he left a wolf in the woods and is surprised that the wolf found its way to the sheep," Sterling replied. He slid a folder across the table. "The CTO position is yours, but I want to know what happens to Richard's company." I stayed silent for a long beat, watching the snow fall outside the window. "The company stays," I said finally, "but the management is going to have a very public, very quiet failure. I want to buy his debt when the bank calls it in next month." That was the moment I understood. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was acquiring. I was using the very boring stability they mocked to anchor a bridge that would lead me right back to their front door, this time as the landlord. Section 6. The Weight of the Crown. The first real crack in the family facade happened on day 14. I was sitting in my loft, coding a new security protocol for Sterling's firm when a video was sent to my old email address. It was from Chloe. She wasn't at a resort. She was in a parked car, her makeup smeared, her voice trembling. "Silas, please," she whispered. "Dad he's not well. He's had a mild panic attack." The bank froze the corporate line because of the inventory discrepancy. "Mark is blaming me for filming that video at the gas station. He says it's my fault you're gone. Mom hasn't left her room in 3 days. I stayed silent because I knew this was another tactic. It was the emotional pivot. When the prank fails and the dominance fails, they move to guilt. They wanted me to feel responsible for the chaos that they initiated. I realized the reason they were falling apart wasn't because I was gone. It was because they didn't know how to function without someone to look down on. I was the grounding wire for their egos. Without me to mock, they had turned their vitriol on each other. The pressure, M-U-S-T, increase. I didn't reply to Chloe. Instead, I sent a single automated email to my father's personal account. It contained nothing but a PDF of the administrative hold on his inventory and a link to a private Zoom meeting scheduled for the following morning. I spent that evening preparing. I didn't want to look like a victim. I didn't want to look like a rebel. I wanted to look like the inevitable conclusion of their choices. The next morning, I sat in front of my webcam. I wore a crisp white shirt. The background was the sleek, minimalist stone of my Omaha loft. I looked successful. I looked cold. When the Zoom window opened, I saw them. They were gathered in my father's study in Chicago. My father looked gray. My mother was clutching a tissue. Mark was pacing in the background like a caged animal. Chloe was staring at the screen, her mouth open. "Silas," my mother cried. "Thank God. Where are you? Are you okay? We were so worried." "No, you weren't," I said. My voice was steady, devoid of anger. "You were annoyed. Then you were inconvenienced. And now you're scared." "Now look here, son," my father started, his voice trying to find that old authoritative rumble. "That joke, it went too far. We admit it. It was a lapse in judgment. But this business with the inventory? You're playing with people's livelihoods. You're playing with my life's work." "I learned from the best," I replied. "You taught me that some people need a real-world challenge to toughen up. Consider this your first lesson." I stayed silent as Mark stepped into the frame, his face flushed. "You think you're a big man now? You're a thief. You hijacked the servers. We could have you arrested." "You could," I said, "but then you'd have to explain to the police, the shareholders, and the press exactly why your son was left at a gas station in O'Neill with no phone and no money. You'd have to explain the prank. And I don't think the board of directors would find it as funny as you did." The room went silent. The threat of public humiliation, the very thing they used as a weapon against me, was now pointed at them. "What do you want?" my father asked. His voice was a whisper. He looked at the screen, and for the first time in my life, he didn't see a calculator. He saw the man who held his entire world in a digital grip. "I want you to understand that the Silas who sat at your dinner table is dead," I said. "He died on a metal bench in Nebraska. The man you're talking to now is your new primary creditor. I've partnered with Sterling. We've been buying up your short-term debt for the last 72 hours. That was the moment I understood. The look on his face wasn't anger. It was the realization that the hierarchy had flipped. He was no longer the patriarch. He was no longer the patriarch. He was a liability. "I'll give you back your inventory," I continued, "but only so you can sell the company. I want your resignation by Friday. Mark, you're out too. Mom, Chloe, I'll make sure your personal trusts are protected, but the legacy is over." I stayed silent because there was nothing left to say. I watched my father sink into his leather chair. I watched Mark stop pacing. I watched the reality of their joke finally settle in their bones. "You're doing this to your own family," my mother sobbed. "No," I said, leaning closer to the camera. "I'm doing this for myself. You're the ones who decided that family was something you could walk away from on a highway. I'm just making the separation official." I ended the call. The silence that followed was different than the silence in the motel. It wasn't empty. It was full of the future. I felt a rising psychological pressure, but this time it wasn't pushing me down. It was lifting me up. I looked at the clock. It was time for my first board meeting at Sterling's. I grabbed my coat and walked out the door. I didn't look back at the screen. I didn't check for messages. The joke was over, and I was the only one who got the punchline. Section 7. The Cost of Admission. The transition of power didn't happen with a shout. It happened with a signature. Standing in the glass-walled conference room of Sterling's headquarters, I watched the digital ink dry on the acquisition documents. My father had no choice. The administrative hold I had placed on his inventory had triggered a cascade of missed delivery windows and contractual penalties. By the time he realized the depth of the hole, I was the only one holding a ladder. I realized that for people like my father, the only language that carries weight is the language of loss. He didn't value my loyalty when it was free, so I had to make it the most expensive thing he ever lost. I stayed silent as Sterling's legal team reviewed the final clauses. My brother, Mark, had sent 17 emails in the last 24 hours. They ranged from threats of litigation to pathetic pleas for a consulting role in the new hierarchy. I didn't reply to a single one. To reply is to acknowledge that their opinions still have currency. In my world, they were now nothing more than bad data points that needed to be purged. The psychological pressure in the room was palpable when my father finally arrived to sign over the controlling interest of Thorne Logistics. He looked smaller than I remembered. The tailored suit that used to project authority now seemed to hang off a frame that had been hollowed out by stress. He didn't look me in the eye. He looked at the mahogany table, at the silver pen, at the city skyline, anywhere but at the calculator who had outmaneuvered him. "You really went through with it," he muttered, his voice gravelly. "You're selling your own father out to his biggest rival." "I'm not selling you out," I said, my voice as calm as a frozen lake. "I'm performing a rescue operation. Without this buyout, you'd be filing for bankruptcy by the end of the quarter. I'm saving your retirement. I'm just removing your hands from the wheel before you crash into anyone else." I realized he still saw himself as the victim. In his mind, leaving me stranded was a lesson, but me taking his company was a betrayal. The double standard was the foundation of his entire personality. I stayed silent because I knew that any further explanation would just be seen as an opening for negotiation. There was nothing left to negotiate. He signed the papers. The scratch of the pen on the parchment was the loudest sound in the room. When he finished, he pushed the folder toward me and stood up. "I hope you're happy, Silas," he said, trying to regain a sliver of his old frostiness. "You've got the chair, you've got the office, but you're alone." "I was alone on a bench in O'Neill, Dad," I replied. "At least here, I can afford the heat." That was the moment I understood. The power I held wasn't just over the company, it was over the narrative. He could no longer tell the story of the weak son. He was now the character in my story, the man who was saved by the person he tried to break. As he walked out, Mark was waiting in the hallway. He looked at me with a mixture of fear and naked ambition. He opened his mouth to speak, probably to offer some brotherly advice on how to run the sales team. I simply nodded to the security guard standing by the elevator. "Mr. Mark Thorne is no longer authorized to be on the premises," I said. The look of pure, stuttering humiliation on Mark's face was the most honest thing I had seen from him in a decade. He wasn't being bullied, he was being ignored. And for a man who lived for attention, that was the ultimate execution. I walked into my new office. It was quiet. The phone didn't ring. The air was still. I sat in the chair, the one my father used to occupy like a throne, and I realized that the seat didn't make me feel powerful. What made me feel powerful was the fact that I didn't need the chair at all. I was the architect. I could build a world anywhere. And they were just residents in a house they no longer owned. Section 8. The Quiet Satisfaction of Closure. 6 months later, the dust had settled. Thorne. Sterling Logistics was the dominant force in the Midwest. I had modernized the entire fleet, implemented the algorithms I'd spent years perfecting in secret, and turned a bloated, ego-driven family business into a surgical, high-efficiency machine. I stayed silent because success doesn't need a press release. The numbers spoke for themselves. I was sitting in a small, quiet cafe in Chicago, not far from the lake. It was a cold Tuesday morning. Across from me sat my mother. She had asked to see me for weeks, and finally I agreed. She looked tired, but the frantic desperation from the Nebraska days had been replaced by a weary sort of acceptance. "Your father spends all his time at the lake house now," she said, stirring her tea. "He doesn't talk about the business. He doesn't talk about much of anything. He just sits." "He has a comfortable life," I said. "That's more than many people get after failing at their jobs." "He misses you, Silas. We all do." I realized she was still trying to bridge a gap that had become a canyon. She wanted the old Silas back, the one who would smile and nod and let them be the stars of the show. She couldn't understand that the version of me she loved was just a mask I wore to survive them. "I'm still here, Mom," I said. "I'm just not a character in your plays anymore." "Was it worth it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "All of this? The company, the money, losing your family?" I stayed silent because the question was flawed. I hadn't lost my family. I had found myself. They were the ones who had gambled the family on a joke. I was the one who had collected the winnings. "I didn't lose anything. I hadn't already lost on that highway," I said. I stood up and placed a $20 bill on the table, enough for her tea and mine, and a generous tip for the waitress. It was the same amount I had earned for my first 2 hours of labor in O'Neill. It was a reminder to myself of where the value truly lies. As I walked out of the cafe, my phone buzzed. It was a notification from the security system at the Nebraska gas station. I had bought the property 3 months ago through a holding company. I didn't tear it down. I didn't change it. I kept it exactly as it was. I looked at the live feed on my phone. The metal bench was still there, silver and cold under the fluorescent lights. It was empty. I realized that bench was the most important classroom I had ever attended. It taught me that status is a shadow and power is the light that casts it. My family had tried to use the shadow to hide me, but they forgot that I was the one holding the lamp. I walked toward my car, a simple, high-end sedan that didn't scream for attention. I had a meeting with a group of investors in an hour. I had a life that was built on competence, restraint, and the quiet dominance of a mind that never stops calculating. The final emotion wasn't triumph. It wasn't the loud, vulgar "I won" that Mark or my father would have craved. It was a quiet, deep-seated satisfaction. It was the feeling of a gear finally clicking into place after years of grinding. I pulled into the flow of traffic, disappearing into the city. I now helped move. I was no longer the boy left behind. I was the one who decided where everyone was going. And as for my family, they were still out there, living in the quiet world I had bought for them, forever wondering when the calculator would decide to turn them off. But I wouldn't. That would be too much effort. Silence, after all, is the most permanent consequence of all.